Before we begin with our examples, let's review some important vocabulary. In this simplest form of inheritance, it's important to understand what dominance means. If an allele is dominant, it means it will always show up in the offspring. Gene symbols are used to help us understand how the inheritance patterns are working. Here are some things to remember before we explore our examples. Gene expression is determined by the pair of alleles that are inherited by an offspring. For example, if an offspring inherits two dominant alleles, it will express the dominant trait and be called homozygous dominant, because homo means the same and the zygote has two of the same alleles. If the offspring were to inherit two recessive alleles, it would express the recessive trait, and it would be called homozygous recessive, again because two of the same types of alleles have been inherited, in this case the recessive allele of blue eyes. If an offspring inherits one of each type of allele, then it will express the dominant trait, because the dominant allele is masking the recessive allele. This means this offspring would have brown eyes, and we call it heterozygous. Hetero meaning different, so two different alleles have been inherited in the zygote. The first example we will use is eye color, where brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. It is important to note that this is an overly simplified example, as many genes affect eye color, and that is why we have more possibilities than just brown and blue. Let's start by looking at the simplest case, a homozygous dominant parent with brown eyes that mates with a homozygous recessive parent that has blue eyes. When these parents form gametes, so the egg and the sperm, they will form half of each type of gamete, half of each allele. So really, the gametes of the brown-eyed parent will all be big B's, and the gametes of the blue-eyed parents will all be little b's, because the brown-eyed parent was homozygous dominant and the blue-eyed parent was homozygous recessive. Because the parents in this case are homozygous, they can only donate one type of allele each, and the offspring will all be the same, heterozygous. Parent 1 can only donate a dominant allele, and parent 2 can only donate a recessive allele. All offspring will have both a dominant and a recessive allele, being heterozygous, and therefore will all express the dominant trait of brown eyes. What happens now if we have two heterozygous parents? Gametes for each parent will consist of half brown-eyed dominant alleles, big B, and half blue-eyed recessive alleles, little b. This will give us more possible combinations in our offspring. Two dominant alleles could combine, resulting in a brown-eyed offspring. One of each could combine, resulting in a heterozygous brown-eyed offspring, or two recessive alleles could combine, resulting in a blue-eyed offspring. Of course, if we have two homozygous recessive parents, the only gametes that would form would contain the recessive blue-eyed alleles, and so all offspring would have to be homozygous recessive and have blue eyes. Here is an example of the gametes that would form from a heterozygous parent and a homozygous recessive parent. You can see that the only two possibilities for offspring would be heterozygous, big B, little b, and homozygous recessive, little b, little b. The offspring would have a 50% chance of being brown-eyed versus blue-eyed. Our next examples will involve pea plants, where pink flower color is dominant to white flower color. It is important to understand the conventions of labeling for this example. Because pink is the dominant version of the trait, we use P as the letter to represent it, and we use an uppercase P for the dominant allele. White is recessive, but we use the letter P because we want the same letter for both alleles. We just use a lowercase p to represent white. Our first example will be a cross between two homozygous parents, one dominant and one recessive. Much like the eye color example earlier, the gametes formed can only contain one type of allele. Once again, the offspring formed will all be heterozygous and express the dominant pink flower color. A cross between two heterozygous parents will have more possibility for variety in their offspring because half of the gametes formed will have the dominant allele and half will have the recessive allele. Possibilities include 2 dominant alleles, pink flowers, 2 recessive alleles, resulting in white flowers, or one of each, a dominant pink and a recessive white, resulting in pink flowers. If we display all of the possibilities for our offspring from these two parents, you can see that in 3 examples, the offspring display the dominant pink flowers, but there is a 1 in 4 chance it will have recessive white flowers even with 2 dominant parents. A Punnett square can be used to easily visualize the offspring from any cross. In a Punnett square, the gametes for one parent are placed at the top of the grid. The gametes for the second parent are placed along the side, leaving space to show possibilities for gamete recombination. Using the grid, we fill each offspring square with the gametes that would combine. In this case, it is easy to see how all offspring from this cross would be heterozygous. The Punnett square is especially helpful when we're looking at more complicated crosses, like this one between 2 heterozygous parents. When we fill in each square, though, the results become obvious. We have 3 offspring that would look dominant and 1 that would look recessive. Even with 2 parents expressing the dominant trait, there is the potential for a recessive offspring.